In this last video segment, let me talk about what we might call really long-run growth. So going beyond the 10, 20, 30 year time horizons to the 40, 50, 100 year time horizons. So getting way out in the future. So let me just repeat a point I posed earlier. So technology, research, and development. For countries that are already at the frontier of knowledge, remember that almost all growth comes from better technology. So well-developed countries like the United States already have a lot of capital per worker, already have a significant amount of human capital per worker, already have access to the highest levels of technology. And if you sort of dig into the numbers some, yes, we could increase our savings and investment rates, but we have so much capital already that it would take a long time before we would really start to increase capital per worker. And we have so much capital per worker already that the amount of difference it would make to have $185,000 of capital per worker instead of $120,000 of capital worker would be pretty small. So pretty much all growth for a developed economy is going to come through faster technological progress. So what can we do to go ahead and increase technological growth? One is that subsidizing education probably does play a role because many, though not all, types of technological improvements and growth are generated through a process of engineering and research and so on and so forth. We might be tempted to sort of say that only science and technology education should be subsidized. But remember that technology is really the knowledge of how to put together factors of production in new and innovative ways. So if someone invents a new way of managing a supply chain using just-in-time inventory methods, that is a kind of technological growth because it allows us to achieve more with the same or achieve more even with less. Or if someone invents a new way to have shareholders elect boards of directors, and that increases the incentive for CEOs to behave responsibly, then that is going to increase the efficiency of the economy, and that's going to go ahead and cause the economy to allocate its resources more efficiently, and we'll get more and better levels of productivity out of that. It could even be something like someone invents a new way for people to work together on Pinterest or, whatever else website out there, and we're able to have cultural goods produced better and more wide-ranging and draw more people into a democratic, productive process. So while it's probably true that the most direct connection between education and technology does occur in science and engineering and the sort of hard technology fields, I don't think we would want to completely neglect other forms of education. The federal government engages in various sorts of research grants. We want to figure out how subatomic particles work, or we want to figure out something about the relationship between a certain kind of bacteria and antibiotic resistance or something like that. These research grants for just super basic scientific research form a background that other sorts of more applied inventions are going to take into account. So when the federal government goes out there and engages in research, typically it's for very basic science that may not have any immediate obvious application. But someday someone may look at that basic science and come with a practical application for it. And that's where something like the research and development tax credit comes in. So essentially, the way this works is companies that spend money on research and development, if they spend, $100 on research and development, they can reduce their tax burden by $100. So that gives a kind of subsidy to research and development, and there's probably good reasons for that. And then finally, something like the patent system. So it wouldn't be very useful to invent a new product if, as soon as you invented it and incurred all the costs of researching and developing and testing it and everything, someone else could instantly come along and duplicate your product and not have to incur any of the expense of developing it. So we have a patent system that gives people a monopoly for a limited period of time so that they can recoup their R&D costs for it. So all of these things help us have a society of innovation and entrepreneurship, and people are going out there and inventing new technologies. And I think it's pretty obvious that, yes, in fact, we do have a high level of technological growth and innovation in our economy. Maybe we could do a little bit better, maybe education could work a little bit better, or maybe we could restructure some of these other elements down here, but it's pretty clear that we do okay on this, I think. A question that often comes up is, what is the impact of population growth on economic development? And the way economists generally think about this is that if you look back to something like the solar model, if you have population growth, then not only do you have to sort of invest enough to overcome depreciation, you also have to invest enough to provide new capital, physical and human capital, for the new generation that's slightly larger than the old generation. So with a high rate of population growth, you effectively have capital diluted as the capital stock is spread over more and more people, and that makes it hard to keep your capital stock per worker high. So essentially, population growth does make it harder to maintain a high level of capital per worker, but it doesn't make it impossible to do so. And certainly we would look back, and if we looked at sort of the prime phases of the Industrial Revolution in, say, the United States or Britain or much of Western Europe, that was actually a time that both had relatively high population growth and relatively high GDP growth. And we certainly also can go out there and see that there are many countries in the world that are having both significant population growth and increases in GDP per capita. So while population growth probably does make it a little bit harder to have the economy grow faster, it certainly is not an absolute barrier to it. There's also a counter-argument here. And the counter-argument essentially goes something like this, that when we have more people, if a certain fraction of people, 1 in a million or something, are real geniuses who are going to come up with great inventions, who are Einsteins, then if we have more people, then we have more Einsteins. And because technology is what we call non-rival, once Einstein invents the theory of relativity, he can share it with everyone, and then everyone can make use of it, then it may be true that a larger population may generate faster technological progress through more ideas being generated, more ideas being shared, and more interactivity. So sort of on net, it's not clear which way population growth would swing. It's also true that if you look around the world right now, almost all countries in the world have seen their fertility rates drop very rapidly over the last 20 or 30 years or so. And we're at about 7 billion people right now. And the projections are that we'll probably stabilize at about 9 billion people worldwide. So population will go up by another, 30-something%. And, that may sound like a relatively large amount, but essentially probably most of the world's population growth that's going to happen has already happened. I think that's probably a better way to think about it. The reason why people worry about population growth, though, I think doesn't have to do so much with these issues of human capital and physical capital and capital dilution and that kind of thing that we see in something like the solar model. I think the fundamental reason why people worry about population growth has to do with natural resources. And this gets into the larger question of, are natural resources a limit to growth? So regardless of whether or not the growth is coming because we have more people at the same level of income, or we have the same number of people at a higher level of income, you can see where natural resources might be a limit to growth. And this could be because natural resources are depletable and we're going to use them up, or even if natural resources were non-depletable, if we have a larger number of people, and if it requires a certain amount of natural resources to support a certain amount of GDP per person, then you could see where it could be that natural resources are going to ultimately limit economic growth. And maybe we wouldn't get into a catastrophe where things crash and burn, but maybe things would just sort of gradually slow down as natural resources become scarcer and scarcer. So there's certainly an argument out there, and a coherent one, that natural resources will eventually limit how much global GDP can rise. And the counter-argument essentially comes down to that, well, technological progress may invent new ways to conserve on natural resources, to generate natural resources in ways that we haven't thought about before, to recycle things, and so on and so forth out there. And a lot of this debate sort of comes down to how fast do we think technological progress will be, and how big do we think sort of the power of human ingenuity will be relative to the meaningfulness of those constraints. And how easily are we going to be able to substitute higher levels of physical and human capital for a relative scarcity of natural capital? And I think the jury's still out on that. I think we just really fundamentally don't know. One way economists like to look at this, to try and resolve this, is to look at the price of various natural resources. So you would think, in general, that if natural resources are becoming more scarce, are becoming a more important constraint on the world's productivity, that natural resource prices would be rising over time on average. Obviously, there's going to be various short-term influences, booms and busts, and disruptions in supply, and, people find new sources of supply and so on and so forth. If the world goes into a recession and oil prices drop or something like that. But what's going to be something we want to look at is what's going to happen to natural resources over the long term. And when you look at the evidence, probably the best way to look at this is something like, how many hours does someone need to work to buy a barrel of oil? Or how many hours does someone need to work to buy a pound of copper or something like that? And when you dig down into that, what we see is that the prices of natural resources have been, as it says here, stable or falling when we look over these relatively long periods. So that looks like natural resources, at least at this point in time, are probably not a huge constraint on our growth. So they're not preventing the world economy from growing, and world GDP has grown pretty rapidly over the last 20 or 30 years. At the same time, the counter argument is that, well, some natural resources are finite, and they are being used up. And it may be true that we find new reserves of oil or something like that, but when you think about it, yes, there is truly a finite amount of oil on the earth, and eventually it will be used up. And how long can we sort of go on finding new sources of natural resources, or finding new ways to sort of compensate for global warming or something like that? Well, I think the honest answer is nobody knows. And I think anyone who says they know is exaggerating their level of confidence, either consciously or just from simple arrogance, essentially. And I think the analogy here I would use here would be something that actually Paul Ehrlich came up with, I believe, one time, and that's the idea of the airplane rivets analogy. And you think about an airplane. An airplane is assembled with rivets, which are simply a type of bolt or screw. And imagine you have someone pulling a rivet out of a plane before every flight. And they take one rivet out of the wing, and it flies to its next destination. And on the next flight, they take out one more rivet, and so on and so forth. And that process could probably go on for some time, because there's a large amount of rivets, and there's some redundancy there. But eventually, there will be a last rivet. And no one knows when that will be. And it might even be that sort of, it's not exactly that there's a last rivet. It's that, well, when you pull the first one out, the risk of a crash goes from 1% to 2%. And when you pull the second one out, the risk of a crash goes from 2% to 4%, and so on and so forth. So I think it's the airplane rivets, or maybe Russian roulette would be the way to think about this. The more we degrade our natural environment, the higher the risk we put ourselves at. And it may be true that no particular one single depletion of our natural capital, there's not one species that will finally be the straw that broke the camel's back, but instead what we're doing is exposing ourselves to a higher and higher level of risk as we deplete these natural resources. And how comfortable we are with that risk and how impatient we are for that long-run growth is ultimately a very, very hard question.